Brother Thomas dipped his brush into the pot of ultramarine blue, paint more precious than gold ground from lapis lazuli, carried across deserts and mountains from mines in distant Afghanistan, and held his breath as he touched the bristles to parchment, beginning the delicate work of painting the Virgin's mantle in a manuscript that would outlive him by centuries. The year was 1348. The place was the scriptorium of Linmore Abbey in the green hills of England, and outside the monastery walls, the world was dying of plague, while inside these walls, in this room of silence and light, Thomas worked to preserve beauty and knowledge against the darkness that seemed determined to swallow everything. Thomas was 28 years old and had been a monk for 12 years, having entered the monastery at 16, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a fierce desire to escape the poverty and uncertainty of village life. He had expected to spend his days in prayer and field work, in the rhythmic repetition of the liturgical hours that structured monastic existence. What he had not expected was to discover that he possessed a gift for illumination, for the painstaking art of decorating manuscripts with colors and gold leaf and intricate designs that transformed mere words into objects of transcendent beauty. Before we continue, if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I share a new one every day. And if you don't mind, leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The scriptorium at Linmore Abbey was a large room on the upper floor of the cloister, positioned to catch the best light from large windows that face south and east. In summer, those windows could be opened to admit air, though never so much that a breeze might disturb the parchment or scatter the precious pigments. In winter, they remained shuttered against the cold, and the monks worked with stiff fingers and visible breath, their only warmth coming from braziers that had to be carefully tended to prevent any spark from reaching the flammable materials that filled the room. 6 desks stood in the scriptorium, each positioned to maximize the available light, each equipped with the tools of the illuminator's trade, brushes of varying sizes made from squirrel hair or badger bristles, pots of pigment in colors that ranged from common earth tones to precious minerals, jars of gold leaf so thin it would float on a breath, bottles of gum, Arabic and egg white for binding the colors, pumice stones for smoothing parchment, knives for scraping away mistakes, rulers and compasses for laying out designs, and the parchment itself, scraped and prepared calfskin so fine and smooth it seemed to glow in the light. 5 of the desks were currently occupied. At the desk nearest the window sat Brother Michael, the master illuminator, a man of 50 years, whose hands had lost some of their steadiness, but whose eye for composition and color remained unmatched. Brother Michael was working on a psalter commissioned by the bishop, a project that would take him another year to complete and would be his masterwork, the culmination of decades of skill and devotion. Beside Michael worked Brother Robert, a scribe rather than an illuminator, whose task was to copy the text in the beautiful Caroline minuscule script that Linmore Abbey favored. Robert's hand moved across the parchment with mechanical precision, each letter perfectly formed, each word properly spaced, his concentration so complete that he seemed barely to breathe. He had been copying manuscripts for 30 years and could write for hours without error, his mind freed from the need to think about the physical act of writing, and thus able to meditate on the meaning of the words even as his hand recorded them. At the 3rd desk sat Brother Geoffrey, the youngest illuminator after Thomas. Though at 35 he was hardly young, Geoffrey specialized in borders and marginalia, those decorative elements that framed the text and filled the margins with vines and flowers, and occasionally with small grotesques, strange creatures, and humorous scenes that seemed incongruous in sacred texts, but which had become traditional in manuscript decoration. Geoffrey worked with a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as if he were perpetually enjoying some private joke, and his marginalia often reflected this humor: a rabbit jousting with a snail, a monk nodding off during prayers, a fox preaching to geese. The 4th desk belonged to Brother William, the pigment master, whose task was to prepare the colors that the other illuminators used. This was skilled work requiring deep knowledge of materials and chemistry, of which substances could be safely mixed and which would corrupt each other, of how to grind minerals to the perfect consistency, of how to blend egg tempera that would neither crack when dry nor run on the parchment. William was a perfectionist who tested each batch of pigment himself, painting small samples and examining them in different lights before approving them for use. And Thomas occupied the fifth desk, positioned between Geoffrey and the window, where he worked on whatever project Brother Michael assigned him. Currently, he was illuminating a Book of Hours, a prayer book for private devotion that a wealthy merchant's widow had commissioned. It was not the most prestigious project in the scriptorium. That honor went to Michael's Psalter, but it was important work nonetheless, and Thomas approached it with the same care and devotion he brought to everything he created. The page before him showed the Annunciation, the moment when the angel Gabriel appeared to Mary to tell her she would bear God's Son. Thomas had already laid out the composition in faint lines, had painted the architectural frame that surrounded the scene, had begun to build up the colors in thin layers as Brother Michael had taught him. Now he was working on the Virgin's mantle, that sweep of blue that would dominate the image, and he used the ultramarine with reverent care, aware that this single pot of pigment was worth more than most people earned in a year. The silence in the scriptorium was not absolute. There was the scratch of Robert's pen, the soft sound of brushes moving across parchment, the occasional scrape of a knife correcting an error, the shifting of weight on wooden stools. But it was a working silence, a silence that somehow emphasized rather than negated the presence of the men who shared this space. They worked together in their separate concentrations, each focused on his own task but aware of the others, part of a community of craft and devotion. The rule of the scriptorium, established by Brother Michael and approved by the abbot, was that work should be conducted in silence except when instruction was necessary, or when a question about the text required discussion. This silence served multiple purposes. It aided concentration, it prevented the kind of casual conversation that might lead to error, and it created an atmosphere of contemplation appropriate to the sacred nature of the work. The monks were not merely copying words or painting pictures. They were preserving the Word of God, transmitting knowledge across generations, creating objects that would instruct and inspire and endure. Thomas loved this silence. He had grown up in a village where life was loud and public, where privacy was impossible and quiet was rare. The scriptorium offered him something he had not known he craved, the space to think, to work, to exist, in his own concentration without the constant demand of voices and obligations. Here, with brush in hand and parchment before him, he felt more himself than he had ever felt anywhere else. The light shifted as clouds moved across the sun, and Thomas paused in his work, waiting for the illumination to stabilize before continuing. This was one of the challenges of the craft, the need to work in consistent light, so that colors would be mixed and applied accurately. A color that looked perfect in morning light might appear completely different in afternoon sun or candlelight, and an illuminator learned to be patient with the weather, to work when conditions were favorable, and to find other tasks when they were not. Brother Michael noticed Thomas's pause and looked up from his own work. "The light is good enough," he said, his voice quiet in the silent room. "You're not working on fine details yet. Continue with the broad areas while you can." Thomas nodded and returned to his work, trusting Michael's judgment. The master illuminator had been teaching Thomas for 8 years now, ever since the day Thomas had been assigned to the scriptorium as a general assistant, and had shown an unexpected aptitude for drawing. Michael had been the one to recognize Thomas's gift, to nurture it through patient instruction, to share the secrets of the craft that could only be passed from master to apprentice through demonstration and practice. The relationship between them was not quite friendship. The monastic hierarchy and the difference in their ages and experience made friendship difficult, but it was something deeper than mere professional respect. Michael had invested years in Thomas's training, had shared not just techniques but understanding, had taught Thomas to see as an illuminator sees, to understand how color and composition and symbol worked together to create meaning. And Thomas had proven himself a worthy student, absorbing everything Michael taught and adding his own sensibility, developing a style that honored tradition while being distinctly his own. As Thomas worked on the Virgin's mantle, building up the ultramarine in thin, even strokes, he thought about the woman who would receive this book of hours, who would hold it in her hands and turn these pages and see these images he was creating. He knew almost nothing about her except that she was a merchant's widow, wealthy enough to commission such a work, presumably pious enough to want it. Would she appreciate the care he was taking? Would she notice the subtle gradations of color, the precise rendering of folds in fabric, the delicate gold highlights he would add later? Or would she simply see a pretty picture, decorative but not deeply meaningful? He tried not to think about such things, tried to remember that his work was offered to God regardless of how any human viewer might receive it. But he was human himself, and the desire for his work to be appreciated, to be understood, persisted despite his efforts to transcend it. Brother Michael said this was natural, that even the most devout craftsman hoped his work would be valued, but that the key was to hold that hope lightly, to do the work for its own sake, and let the appreciation come or not as it would. The morning office bells rang, their sound penetrating even the thick walls of the scriptorium, and the monks set down their tools with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this hundreds of times before. They covered their work to protect it from dust, cleaned their brushes, and filed out of the scriptorium in silence, heading toward the church where they would join the other monks in prayer. Thomas always experienced a small reluctance when the bells called him away from his work. Not that he resented prayer. The liturgical hours structured his day and gave it meaning, but the transition from the absorption of illumination to the communal act of worship required a mental shift that was not always easy. In the scriptorium, he was alone with his work and his thoughts. In the church, he was part of a community, his individual voice absorbed into the collective chant, his private devotion merged with corporate worship. But this tension, he had come to understand, was itself part of the monastic life. This constant movement between solitude and community, between individual work and communal prayer, between the particular and the universal. The monastery was designed to balance these opposing needs, to give each monk both the space to develop his gifts and the structure of community, to prevent those gifts from becoming sources of pride or isolation. The church at Linmore Abbey was not large or particularly grand, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. Stone pillars rising to support a vaulted ceiling, narrow windows admitting shafts of light that struck the floor in geometric patterns, the altar simple but well tended, the crucifix above it carved from dark wood and showing Christ in his suffering with unflinching realism. The monks filed into their choir stalls, standing in 2 rows facing each other across the central aisle, their voices rising in the ancient psalms that had been sung in this place for 300 years. This forgetting felt like another kind of death, a betrayal of her even while she might still be alive. He should remember her better. He should have paid more attention during his visits, should have studied her features the way he studied manuscripts, should have committed every detail to memory while he had the chance. But he had not, because he had not known that chance might be so limited, because death had seemed like something that happened to other families, to other villages, not to his own. Sleep came eventually, fitful and populated by dreams of blood and darkness, and pages that crumbled to dust beneath his hands. The next days established a rhythm of work and prayer and waiting. The abbot received daily reports from the village, and the news was never good. More families sick, more dead. The disease spreading with terrible efficiency through the crowded cottages where multiple generations lived together in single rooms. Some villagers came to the monastery seeking shelter and care, and the infirmary filled with the groaning sick. But many more stayed in their homes, either too sick to move, or refusing to abandon their families to die among strangers. Thomas worked in the scriptorium with desperate focus, trying to lose himself in the illumination the way Brother Michael had advised. He finished the Virgin's mantle and began on the angel Gabriel, giving the celestial messenger wings of such intricate detail that each individual feather showed the variations in color and shadow that real feathers would show. He worked on the faces, trying to capture both divine otherness and recognizable humanity, the paradox at the heart of the incarnation, God becoming human, the infinite contained in the finite, eternity-touching time. Sometimes as he worked, he found moments of peace, brief spaces where the work absorbed him so completely that he forgot to be afraid, forgot to grieve, forgot everything except the movement of the brush and the slow emergence of beauty from blank parchment. These moments never lasted. His anxiety would return crashing over him like a wave, but their existence proved that escape was possible, that the mind could find refuge even in the midst of catastrophe, that work could be a form of grace. Brother Geoffrey, working at the desk beside him, spoke more than usual during these days, his natural cheerfulness subdued but still present, offering stories and small observations that helped pass the time. He told Thomas about the manuscripts he had seen in other scriptoria, about particular techniques for creating borders, about the symbolism behind various marginal grotesques. He showed Thomas how to draw a dragon that seemed to intertwine with the text, how to make a vine that appeared to grow up the page organically rather than being obviously painted, how to include hidden details that would reward the careful observer, a tiny face among leaves, a bird so small it was barely visible, a mouse stealing communion wafers from an inattentive priest. The margins are where we can breathe, Geoffrey explained. The text is sacred. The main illustrations must be dignified and proper, but the margins are ours. We can put humor there, commentary, little observations about life. Future readers will see them and know that we were human, that we saw the absurdity of existence even as we tried to create beauty and preserve truth. Thomas appreciated these lessons, appreciated the distraction they offered, appreciated Geoffrey's kindness in offering his attention when he must have had his own concerns. Most of the monks had family in nearby villages, people they worried about, people they prayed for but could not help. The monastery was an island of relative safety in a sea of disease, and everyone inside those walls carried the guilt and relief of being spared, while others suffered. Brother William the pigment master became quieter during these days, speaking even less than the silence of the scriptorium normally required. Thomas learned from Geoffrey that William had a daughter in the village, born before he took his vows, raised by her mother's family, but still precious to the monk who had given her life. William ground his pigments with fierce concentration, testing and retesting each batch, as if perfection in this small domain could somehow balance the chaos beyond the monastery walls. Brother Robert the scribe continued his mechanical copying, his hand moving across the parchment with the same precision it had always shown. But Thomas noticed that he worked longer hours, staying in the scriptorium well past dark, copying by candlelight until Michael ordered him to rest. Work as refuge, work as prayer, work as the only available response to helplessness. They all understood this, now these monks who had chosen lives of contemplation and service, but who now found themselves spectators to tragedy. They could neither prevent nor flee. A week passed, then two. The reports from the village grew worse, then leveled off as the disease ran out of new victims, having already killed everyone susceptible. The final tally was devastating. Nearly half the village dead, whole families wiped out, children orphaned, the normal patterns of life shattered beyond quick repair. The abbot began to allow limited contact again, sending monks to help bury the dead, to care for the orphaned children, to try to restore some semblance of order. Thomas waited to hear news of his family with a dread that made him nauseous. He could not eat, could barely sleep, moved through his days in a fog of anticipation and fear. Brother Michael watched him with concern but said nothing, understanding that there were no words adequate to this particular suffering, that all anyone could do was wait and hope and try to continue functioning. The news, when it finally came, was mixed. Thomas's mother had died, along with his younger brother. His sisters had both survived, though one had lost her husband and infant son. The message came through the abbot, delivered in the chapter meeting where all the monks gathered to hear announcements and conduct the monastery's business. Thomas heard his name, heard the words, and felt the world tilt beneath him. His mother, who had given him life and raised him and sent him to the monastery with her blessing. His brother, barely 15, who had his whole life ahead of him, who had never had a chance to become whoever he might have become. Gone, dead, buried in the churchyard in graves. Thomas had not been present to see Doug, had not stood beside to mourn properly, had not filled with his own hands the way duty and love demanded. He stumbled from the chapter meeting and made his way to the church, where he knelt before the altar and tried to pray but couldn't form coherent words. His grief was too large, too overwhelming, too absolute to fit into the structures of formal prayer. So he knelt in silence, tears streaming down his face, his body shaking with sobs he could no longer suppress, and he waited for something, comfort, understanding, peace, that did not come. Brother Michael found him there an hour later, still kneeling, still weeping, still waiting. The master illuminator sat beside him on the cold stone floor and said nothing, just sat there in companionable silence while Thomas's grief slowly exhausted itself, slowly subsided from racking sobs to quiet tears to eventual stillness. "Come," Michael said finally, standing with some difficulty. "Come back to the scriptorium. I have something to show you." Thomas followed, numb and empty, drained of everything except a hollow ache that seemed to fill him completely. In the scriptorium, Michael led him to his own desk, where the psalter for the bishop lay in its current state of completion. The page Michael indicated showed the opening of Psalm 42. "Food, as the deer longs for streams of water, so my soul longs for you, O God." The illumination was extraordinary. A deer stood beside a stream, its head lowered to drink, every muscle and line of its body conveying desperate thirst and the relief of finding water at last. The colors were rich but not gaudy, the composition balanced perfectly, the gold leaf glowing as if lit from within. But what struck Thomas most was the deer's eye. Michael had painted it with such skill that it seemed to look directly at the viewer, and in that painted eye Thomas saw his own longing, his own desperation, his own thirst for something that would make sense of suffering, that would justify loss, that would allow him to continue existing in a world that had become unbearable. "I painted that page 30 years ago," Michael said quietly, "after my family died. I could not pray, I could not eat, I could barely function, but I could paint, and so I painted, and I poured everything I felt into that deer's eye. And you know what I discovered? That art can hold what prayer cannot. That beauty can contain grief without being destroyed by it. That the work we do here matters not because it prevents suffering, but because it acknowledges suffering and transforms it into something that endures." Thomas stared at the page, unable to look away from that eye that seemed to see him so completely. "I don't know if I can," he whispered. "You can," Michael replied. "Not today, perhaps. Not this week. But eventually, the work will still be here. The Virgin's mantle still needs completing. The angel's wings still need painting. The gold leaf still needs laying. And when you're ready, you'll return to it, and you'll find that the work receives your grief and transforms it and gives it back to you as something beautiful, something that others will see and recognize, something that will speak to them about their own losses, their own longings, their own desperate thirst for streams of water." The abbot granted Thomas permission to attend his mother's burial, though she had already been in the ground for several days. Thomas walked to the village, with Brother Michael accompanying him, both monks wearing their habits and carrying their rosaries, two figures in black moving through a landscape that seemed diminished somehow, smaller and grayer than Thomas remembered. The village was devastated. Houses stood empty, their doors hanging open, their interiors already being looted by survivors desperate for anything useful. The streets were nearly deserted. Those who remained were either too sick to venture out or too traumatized to function normally. The smell of death lingered despite the mass burials, despite the fires that had burned contaminated belongings, despite desperate efforts to cleanse the space where so many had died. The churchyard was crowded with new graves, rough mounds of earth marking where the dead lay in common trenches, too many bodies to allow for individual burials. Thomas found his mother's grave by asking the priest, a haggard man who looked as if he had not slept in weeks. The priest pointed to a trench near the eastern wall, marked by a wooden cross on which several names had been carved, his mother's among them. Thomas knelt beside the grave while Michael stood behind him, a supportive presence but not an intrusive one. He tried to find words to say goodbye, to express love and gratitude and sorrow, but everything he thought of seemed inadequate, seemed too small to contain what he felt. So finally he simply said, "I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry I couldn't help you. I hope God receives you with the mercy and love you show to everyone you met. I will pray for you every day. I will remember you in my work." He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and turned to find his sisters. They were living together now in the house of the one whose husband had survived, combining their resources to manage in the wake of catastrophe. When Thomas arrived, they embraced him with desperate strength, and they wept together. 3 siblings who had lost their mother and their youngest brother, and whose world would never be the same. His sister Agnes, the one who had lost her husband and son, looked hollowed out, emptied of everything except the mechanical necessity of continuing to exist. She moved and spoke and functioned, but Thomas could see that something essential had been extinguished. Some light that had animated her now gone. Her surviving sister Margaret was trying to care for both of them, managing the household, dealing with practicalities, being strong, because someone had to be. But Thomas could see the cost of that strength in the lines around her eyes, and the way her hands shook when she thought no one was watching. They talked for an hour, sharing memories of their mother, speaking of their brother with the particular pain that comes from losing someone so young, someone who never had the chance to fully become himself. They asked Thomas about the monastery, about his work, about his life. But he could tell their questions were partly politeness, partly a way to avoid dwelling too long on their grief. They were drowning, and conversation was a momentary handhold, something to cling to while the waves crashed over them. When it was time to leave, Thomas pressed coins into Margaret's hand. Not much, but what he could gather from the small personal allowance the monastery gave its members. She tried to refuse, but he insisted, knowing they would need every resource they could find in the hard months ahead. He promised to visit when he could, to pray for them daily, to remember them always, and then he walked away, following Michael back toward the monastery, looking back once to see his sisters standing in the doorway, 2 women alone in a world that had become dangerous and uncertain, and he felt the tearing of his heart, the impossible tension between his vocation and his family, between the life he had chosen and the people he still loved. "That never gets easier," Michael said as they walked. "The leaving, I mean. The return to the monastery when family needs you. I used to think it would. That prayer and discipline would eventually make it hurt less, but it doesn't. It just becomes familiar, the way any chronic pain becomes familiar. You learn to function with it, to work despite it, but it never stops hurting." "Then why do we stay?" Thomas asked, and immediately regretted the question. It sounded like doubt, like criticism of the monastic life, like ingratitude for the stability and purpose the monastery provided. But Michael did not seem offended. "Because this is our vocation," he said simply. "Because we were called to this life, and we answered that call, and the calling doesn't disappear just because it becomes difficult. Because the work we do matters, even when, especially when, the world is falling apart. Someone has to preserve knowledge, to create beauty, to maintain continuity with the past so that the future has something to build on. If everyone abandons their posts when things get hard, then everything collapses. So we stay, we work, we pray. We make our small offerings of beauty and knowledge and hope, even when hope seems foolish, even when beauty seems irrelevant, even when knowledge seems useless against the simple fact of death." They walked in silence for a while, and then Michael continued, his voice softer now. "I will tell you something I have never told anyone else. When my family died, I considered leaving the monastery. I thought, what is the point? What good are illuminated manuscripts when people are dying? What use is beauty when the world is so full of suffering? I went to the abbot and told him I wanted to be released from my vows. And do you know what he said? Thomas shook his head. He said, "Go, if you must. But before you do, finish one more page. Complete one more illumination. Then decide." Yeah, so I went back to the scriptorium, and I painted that deer beside the stream. And as I worked, I understood something. The point isn't that beauty prevents suffering. The point is that beauty exists alongside suffering, and that juxtaposition is itself meaningful. The fact that we can create something beautiful even while grieving, the fact that we can preserve knowledge even while losing the people who taught it to us, the fact that we can maintain hope even when hope seems absurd, that is itself a kind of resistance to despair, a kind of defiance against the darkness that wants to swallow everything. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was firm with conviction. So I stayed. I finished that page, and then I started the next one, and then the next, and I have been starting the next page every day for 30 years. And each page is an act of faith, a declaration, that meaning persists even when we cannot see it, that beauty matters even when we cannot explain why, that the work of our hands is a prayer that reaches further than any words could go. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, some small easing of the weight he carried. He was not convinced. Grief was too fresh, loss too recent, the ache too sharp to be resolved by words alone. But he heard in Michael's testimony a possibility, a suggestion that he might survive this, that the pain might not destroy him entirely. That work might indeed be a way through the wilderness of loss rather than merely a distraction from it. When they returned to the monastery, Thomas did not go immediately to the scriptorium. Instead, he went to the church and knelt before the altar, and this time when he tried to pray, words came. They were not eloquent words, not the polished phrases of formal liturgy, but they were real, raw expressions of grief and anger and confusion and faint, stubborn hope that somehow meaning could be salvaged from catastrophe, that his mother's life and death were not meaningless, that beauty could still matter in a world that seemed designed to destroy it. He prayed for his mother's soul, for his brother's soul, for his sisters who had survived but who might wish they had not, for all the dead of the village, for the living who now had to rebuild from ruins, for himself, and for the strength to continue working even when work seemed pointless, even when creation seemed like a futile gesture against the inevitability of destruction. And when he had prayed himself empty, he stood and walked to the scriptorium, where his unfinished page waited on his desk, where the Virgin's mantle still needed completing, where the angel's wings still needed painting, where work remained to be done regardless of plague or death or grief. He sat at his desk, picked up his brush, examined the page with eyes that saw it differently now than they had 2 weeks ago. The Virgin looked back at him from the parchment, her face serene but not oblivious, her eyes showing knowledge of suffering even in this moment before it had fully arrived, as if she already knew what her yes would cost her, what sorrows awaited her, what losses she would endure. Thomas mixed his ultramarine, tested it on a scrap of parchment, adjusted the consistency until it was exactly right. Then he touched brush to page and continued the work of building beauty from pigment and parchment, creating something that would endure beyond his lifetime, beyond his grief, beyond the plague that had taken his family and the centuries of other plagues that would follow, beyond everything except the simple fact that once, in a scriptorium in England, a monk named Thomas had painted a virgin's mantle with hands that shook from grief, but that still knew how to hold a brush steady, hands that had learned their craft through years of patient practice, and that would not forget that craft, even when they forgot how to do almost everything else. The work received him. The brush moved across the parchment, building color, creating form, transforming blank space into image. Time passed, an hour, 2 hours, more, and Thomas found that he could breathe again, could think again, could exist in something other than pure pain. The grief remained, would always remain, but it was not the only thing he was anymore. He was also an illuminator, a craftsman, a monk who made beautiful pages, and that identity gave him a way to carry his grief rather than being crushed by it. Brother Michael, working at his own desk, glanced over periodically and saw what was happening, saw Thomas returning to himself through the work, saw hands finding their steadiness again, saw concentration replacing despair. He said nothing, asked nothing, simply worked on his own page and let Thomas find his way back to the community of craft and silence and shared purpose. The days became weeks, and the weeks became months. Summer came, bringing longer days and better light for working. The scriptorium filled with warmth and brightness, and the monks shed their winter layers and opened the windows to let air move through the room. Thomas worked on his Book of Hours with renewed dedication, pouring into it everything he had learned about both craft and grief, creating images that were technically proficient but also emotionally resonant, pictures that spoke of more than they literally showed. The Virgin's face, when he finally completed it, had his mother's eyes. Not literally, not recognizably to anyone else, but Thomas knew. The tilt of her head as she listened to the angel was the tilt his mother had used when listening to her children's problems. The gesture of her hand, partly acceptance and partly benediction, was a gesture he had seen his mother make 1,000 times when offering comfort or permission or simple acknowledgement that she heard what was being said. No one else would see this. To other viewers, the Virgin would simply be well painted, appropriately beautiful, properly pious. But Thomas would always know that he had put his mother in this image, had made her part of this manuscript, had ensured that something of her would persist beyond her grave in the crowded churchyard, beyond the memories of her children, beyond the inevitable forgetting that claimed all lives eventually. He painted the angel Gabriel with his brother's youth and energy, with the beauty of someone whose life was full of potential not yet realized. He made the architectural frame ornate and detailed, filling it with flowers and vines that represented growth and life, continuing even after individual deaths. He worked gold leaf into the halos and borders, making them glow with a light that seemed to come from beyond the page itself. Light that suggested transcendence, transformation, the possibility that death was not the end of everything. When the page was finally complete, Brother Michael examined it with his critical master's eye, looking for flaws in technique or composition or execution. He studied it in different lights, from different angles, with the scrutiny of someone who had spent decades evaluating manuscripts. Finally he nodded. "It's good work," he said, and from Michael this was high praise. "Better than good. You found something here, Thomas, something beyond mere technical skill. You found a way to make the image mean more than itself, to carry emotional weight without becoming sentimental, to speak to viewers without preaching at them. This is what separates competent illumination from true artistry. This ability to invest the work with genuine feeling that transcends the particular moment of creation." Thomas felt a flush of pride and gratitude, and something like vindication. The work had saved him, as Michael had promised it would. It had given him a way to process grief that was too large for words, a way to honor his mother and brother that was more lasting than any spoken eulogy, a way to transform loss into beauty that others would see and perhaps be moved by, though they would never know the personal grief that had fed into its creation. The Book of Hours was completed over the following months, page after page of text and illumination, each image receiving the same care and attention as that first Annunciation. Thomas painted the Nativity and the Crucifixion, the Resurrection and the Pentecost, the various saints and angels and prophets who populated the liturgical calendar. Each image became an opportunity to explore some aspect of human experience. Joy and sorrow, hope and despair, birth and death, love and loss, all filtered through the sacred narratives that Christianity provided as frameworks for making meaning. He learned, as he worked, that grief did not disappear, but it did evolve. The sharp edge of initial loss gradually wore down into a chronic ache that was bearable, that could be lived with, that did not prevent functioning even if it prevented ever being entirely comfortable again. He learned to carry his mother's and brother's absences the way the monastery's stone walls carried their weight, by distributing the burden across a broad foundation, by not expecting any single support to bear everything, by building carefully and maintaining constantly. His sisters wrote occasionally, brief letters delivered by travelers passing between the village and the monastery. They were managing, they said, though life was hard. Agnes remained hollow, going through the motions of existence but showing little sign of recovering her former self. Margaret was stronger, or at least better at appearing strong, and she had taken responsibility for both of them with the grim determination of someone who had no choice but to persevere. They asked about Thomas, about his work, about the monastery, but their questions had the quality of politeness rather than genuine curiosity. They lived in different worlds now, worlds that touched only occasionally, and Thomas accepted that this was how things would be. He loved them, prayed for them, helped them when he could, but his life was here, in the scriptorium, among the pigments and parchment and the patient daily work of creation. Brother Michael's Psalter progressed slowly toward completion. It would be, everyone agreed, his masterwork, the culmination of decades of skill and vision and devoted labor. Each page was a wonder, each illumination a small masterpiece. Nobles and churchmen who visited the monastery and were shown examples of the work would invariably offer to purchase it, sometimes for extravagant sums, but the bishop who had commissioned it would not be swayed. This would be his psalter, his treasure, his legacy to the cathedral he served. Thomas watched Michael work on the psalter with a mixture of admiration and concern. The master illuminator was aging visibly, his hands increasingly troubled by tremors, his eyes straining in even the best light, his back bent from decades of hunching over manuscripts. But he refused to slow down, refused to acknowledge his body's limitations, driven by some inner necessity to finish this last great work before his strength failed entirely. "I will not die with this unfinished," Michael told Thomas one day, and though he said it lightly, Thomas heard the determination beneath the words. The psalter had become more than a commission to Michael. It was his statement, his testimony, his way of ensuring that his life's work culminated in something worthy of the devotion he had given to his craft. Thomas helped when Michael would allow it, taking on some of the less critical work, preparing colors, cutting parchment, even painting some of the simpler borders under Michael's direction. It was an honor to be allowed to contribute even marginally to such a project, and Thomas tried to make his work worthy of the trust Michael showed in him. The autumn of Thomas's 30th year brought changes to the scriptorium. Brother Robert the scribe died suddenly one morning, went to his desk as usual, worked for an hour, set down his pen, laid his head on his arms, and simply stopped breathing. It was a peaceful death, the kind that monks prayed for, death in the midst of service, death without suffering or fear or prolonged decline. They found him with his last page before him, the text perfectly copied. No errors to mar the work he had been completing for 3 decades. His death left a gap in the scriptorium, both practical and emotional. Scribes were not easily replaced. The skill required years to develop, and the particular style that Robert had mastered was specific to Linmore Abbey. A younger monk named Brother James was assigned to learn scribing, and Thomas found himself helping to teach the newcomer, passing on what he knew about spacing and letter forms, and maintaining concentration through hours of meticulous work. Teaching forced Thomas to articulate knowledge he had absorbed almost unconsciously, to explain techniques he had learned through imitation and practice. He discovered that he was good at this, that he could break down complex skills into manageable steps, that he had patience for repetition and correction, and the slow progress of someone learning difficult crafts. Brother James proved an apt student, though he struggled with the sustained concentration that scribing required. Where Thomas could work for hours in absorbed focus, James's attention wandered, needed to be recalled, required frequent breaks. "Not everyone has the gift for this work," Michael observed, watching James struggle through a particularly difficult passage. "The hands can be trained, the eyes can learn to see, but the mind either has the capacity for sustained focus or it doesn't. James will learn to scribe competently, but he will never have Robert's gift for losing himself in the work." "Is that necessary?" Thomas asked. "The losing yourself?" "For work of the highest quality, yes," Michael replied. Good work can be done consciously, mechanically, by following rules and maintaining attention. But great work, work that transcends mere competence, requires something more. It requires that you disappear into the work so completely that the boundary between you and what you're creating dissolves. Then the work becomes not just skillful but inspired, not just correct but alive. Thomas understood this from his own experience. His best illuminations had all been created in states of near total absorption, times when hours passed like minutes, when his sense of self faded and only the work remained. The Annunciation page with his mother's eyes had been painted in such a state, and he knew that the particular quality it possessed, that emotional resonance Michael had praised, came precisely from his having disappeared into it so completely, having poured himself into it so thoroughly that something essential transferred from him to the parchment. Brother William, the pigment master, began to teach Thomas more about color theory and materials, sharing knowledge accumulated over decades of mixing and testing and refining. Thomas learned which minerals produced which hues, how to grind them to the perfect consistency, how to bind them with egg tempera or gum arabic depending on the desired effect. He learned about fugitive colors that faded in light and stable colors that would endure for centuries. He learned about the chemistry of gold leaf, about the gesso that prepared parchment to receive it, about the burnishing techniques that made it glow. Color is meaning, William explained one day, grinding a particularly fine batch of vermilion. We think of it as decoration, as mere prettiness, but the old masters understood that each color carries associations, evokes responses, communicates messages. Blue for heaven, for the divine, for transcendence. That's why we use ultramarine for the Virgin's mantle, why we spare no expense to get the finest lapis lazuli. Red for passion, for sacrifice, for blood. Christ's robes, the martyr's wounds. Green for life, for growth, for the natural world. Gold for glory, for divinity, for light that comes from beyond the material plane. Every color we choose is a choice about meaning, about what we want the viewer to understand and feel. Thomas had intuited some of this, but had never heard it articulated so clearly. He began to pay more attention to his color choices, thinking not just about what looked good, but about what each hue communicated, how the palette of an illumination could reinforce or complicate its ostensible subject. He experimented with unusual combinations, with colors that tradition did not typically pair, and sometimes he created effects that surprised even Brother Michael. "You're developing your own style," Michael observed approvingly. "That's good. Every illuminator should honor tradition, but the best ones also bring something new, some personal vision that makes their work distinctive. Don't be so innovative that you violate the conventions. Manuscripts have rules for good reasons. But don't be so bound by convention that your work becomes merely competent repetition of what's been done before." Thomas worked to find this balance, to honor the tradition he had been taught, while also exploring his own aesthetic intuitions. He discovered that he had a gift for faces, for capturing subtle expressions and gestures that conveyed complex emotions. He became known in the monastery for this. When a particularly important portrait was needed, when some donor wanted their image included in a manuscript, Thomas was the one Brother Michael assigned to the task. He painted the abbot for the monastery's records, capturing not just the physical features but something of the man's character, his severity tempered by genuine care for his monks, his administrative skill balanced by sincere piety, his position of authority worn with appropriate gravity, but also with hints of the warmth he showed in private. The abbot was pleased with the portrait, and word spread to other monasteries, to bishops and nobles, that Lindmore Abbey had an illuminator of exceptional skill. The commissions increased, bringing much-needed revenue to the monastery. Nobles wanted books of hours, bishops wanted psalters, wealthy merchants wanted illustrated pedigrees to display their lineage and status. Thomas worked on all of these with the same care he brought to every project, though he found that he enjoyed some more than others. The sacred subjects still moved him most deeply, still felt like they tapped into something beyond his conscious skill. The secular commissions, portraits, genealogies, illustrations of courtly life, He executed competently but without the same sense of purpose. "That's normal," Brother Geoffrey assured him when Thomas mentioned this. "Sacred art is about transcendence. Secular art is about worldly concerns. Both have value, both require skill, but they engage different parts of us. The challenge is to bring the same quality of attention to all work, regardless of subject. To paint a nobleman's face with the same care you'd paint a saint's, not because the nobleman is holy, but because the work itself deserves your best effort." Thomas tried to embrace this philosophy, though he was not always successful. Sometimes working on a secular commission, he felt that he was merely performing technical exercises, demonstrating skill without deeper purpose. But he completed the work regardless, accepted the payment the monastery received, and returned with relief to sacred subjects when he could. Brother Michael's Psalter was finally completed in the winter of Thomas's 32nd year. The final page was painted, the binding was commissioned from a master craftsman in London, and the finished manuscript was delivered to the bishop in a ceremony that brought nobles and churchmen from across the region to witness the unveiling of what many considered the finest illuminated manuscript produced in England in a generation. Thomas attended the ceremony standing at the back of the hall while the bishop examined the Psalter page by page, exclaiming over particular illuminations, praising the quality of the work, declaring it a treasure that would glorify God and bring honor to his cathedral for centuries to come. Brother Michael stood beside the bishop, accepting the praise with appropriate humility, but unable to completely hide his satisfaction and pride in what he had accomplished. Thomas felt his own pride in his teacher's achievement, but also a pang of sorrow. The Psalter was complete. Michael's masterwork was finished, and Thomas could see in the older man's face and bearing that finishing this great work had cost him much of his remaining strength. Michael had driven himself to complete it, had refused to acknowledge his body's decline until the work was done, and now that it was done, he had nothing left to prove, nothing left to hold the frailty at bay. Within a month of the Psalter's completion, Brother Michael became seriously ill. It started as a cough, the kind that monks working in cold scriptoria often developed, but it did not improve with rest or with the herbal remedies the infirmarian provided. The cough deepened, became productive of blood-tinged phlegm, left Michael gasping for breath after even minor exertion. He could no longer work in the scriptorium. The effort of climbing the stairs left him exhausted, and he took to his bed in the infirmary surrounded by monks who prayed for his recovery, but who increasingly understood that recovery was unlikely. Thomas visited daily, sitting beside Michael's bed, reporting on the work continuing in the scriptorium, describing projects in progress, asking questions about technique that gave Michael opportunities to teach, even as his strength failed. They both understood what was happening. Both knew that these visits were farewells being drawn out over days and weeks, but neither spoke of it directly. Instead, they talked about illumination, about particular challenges and solutions, about manuscripts Michael had worked on over the decades, about the craft that had defined his life and given it meaning. "You'll be the master illuminator now," Michael said one day, his voice weak but clear. "The abbot will appoint you. You're ready for it, Thomas. You have the skill, the judgment, the commitment. You understand that this work is not just about making beautiful objects, but about serving something larger than yourself." "I'm not ready," Thomas protested. "There's still so much I don't know, so much I haven't mastered." "No one is ever ready," Michael replied. "I wasn't ready when I became Master Illuminator. I was your age, maybe a year older, and I felt completely inadequate to the responsibility. But readiness isn't about knowing everything. It's about being willing to learn, willing to take responsibility, willing to care about the work and about the people you'll be teaching. You have all of that. You'll be fine." Michael died 3 days later, in the early morning, with several monks praying at his bedside. Thomas was there, and he held Michael's hand as the older man's breathing grew shallower and slower and finally stopped entirely. It was a peaceful death, dignified and surrounded by community, the kind of death that was counted as a blessing. But Thomas felt Michael's loss like another tearing, another essential person removed from his life, another absence that would have to be learned to carry. They buried Michael in the monastery cemetery, in a grave marked by a simple stone that gave his name and dates and identified him as Illuminator. The abbot spoke the funeral liturgy, and the monks sang the psalms that Michael had illustrated so many times, the familiar words taking on new resonance now that they were being sung over his grave. Thomas stood in the cold winter rain and thought about the manuscripts Michael had created, about the knowledge he had shared, about the patient kindness he had shown to a young monk who had arrived in the scriptorium with nothing but raw potential and had been shaped through Michael's teaching into an illuminator who could carry the tradition forward. As Michael had predicted, the abbot appointed Thomas as the new master illuminator. It was an honor but also a burden. Suddenly he was responsible not just for his own work, but for the entire scriptorium, for teaching younger monks, for accepting and managing commissions, for maintaining the quality and reputation that Michael had established over decades. Thomas felt overwhelmed by the responsibility, but he accepted it because refusing was not an option, because someone had to do it, because the work needed to continue regardless of individual readiness or reluctance. He began by reorganizing this scriptorium, not dramatically, but in small ways that reflected his own priorities and working style. He promoted Brother Geoffrey to senior illuminator, recognizing the older monk's skill and experience. He continued Brother James's training in scribal work, though he also recognized that James would never be more than competent. He took on 2 new apprentices, young monks who showed artistic aptitude and who needed training in the craft. Teaching became a larger part of his life than he had anticipated. He found that he enjoyed it, that the process of articulating techniques and demonstrating skills deepened his own understanding, that watching younger monks develop their abilities gave him satisfaction that was different from but equal to the satisfaction of his own creation. He tried to teach as Michael had taught him, patiently, without anger or frustration when students struggled, with high standards but also with recognition that learning took time and that mistakes were necessary parts of the process. The scriptorium continued its work, producing manuscripts that maintained Lindmore Abbey's reputation for quality. Thomas accepted commissions carefully, turning down some that seemed purely mercenary or that would require compromising artistic integrity for patron preferences. He learned to negotiate with nobles and bishops to balance their desires with the realities of what could be achieved with available materials, and time to manage expectations while still delivering work that satisfied and often exceeded what had been requested. His own style matured and became more confident. He moved beyond strict imitation of Michael's techniques and began to develop innovations that were distinctively his own. A particular way of rendering fabric, a signature use of color in landscapes, a method of creating perspective that gave his images unusual depth. Other illuminators noticed these innovations, and some began to adopt them, so that Thomas's influence spread beyond Lindmore Abbey to scriptoria across England, and eventually beyond. But success brought its own challenges. The more skilled Thomas became, the more he was in demand, and the more in demand he was, the less time he had for the sustained concentration that had once been his refuge. Administrative duties accumulated, managing the scriptorium supplies and budget, coordinating with scribes and binders and other craftsmen, dealing with patrons and their often unreasonable expectations. He found himself spending less time at his desk actually painting and more time organizing others' work, and he felt the loss of that direct engagement with materials and images. He tried to maintain a balance, to reserve certain hours for his own illumination, to protect the time he needed for the work that still fed his soul. But it was difficult, and there were weeks when he painted hardly at all, when his role as master illuminator was almost entirely administrative, when he went to bed tired from a day of managing others rather than creating himself. Brother Geoffrey noticed his frustration and offered perspective one evening as they sat together in the scriptorium after the other monks had left. "This is the price of mastery," Geoffrey said. "When you're young and learning, all your time is your own. You can paint for hours every day because that's your only responsibility. But as you become more skilled, more trusted, more essential to the enterprise, your responsibilities multiply. You become responsible not just for your own work, but for the entire tradition, for training the next generation, for ensuring that the scriptorium continues to function. It's a different kind of service, and it has its own satisfactions, but it does mean less time for the pure pleasure of creation. I miss it, Thomas admitted. I miss disappearing into the work, losing track of time, emerging hours later with something beautiful that didn't exist before. Now I spend my days making sure other people can have that experience. And I'm grateful they can, but I miss having it myself. Then you need to protect it, Jeffrey said firmly. Not all of it. You can't return to being a young apprentice with no responsibilities. But some of it. Reserve 2 hours each day, or 1 day each week, or whatever you can manage, and make that time sacred. Let nothing interrupt it. The administrative work will always be there. It expands to fill whatever time you give it. But if you don't protect time for your own creation, you'll wake up one day and realize you've become purely a manager, that you've stopped being an illuminator, except in title. Thomas took this advice seriously. He began to wake earlier, to claim the first hours of each day before the monastery's routine fully began, before petitioners arrived seeking his attention, before the demands of administration could intrude. In those quiet morning hours, he returned to his own work, to the pages he was illuminating, to the pure engagement with materials and images that had first drawn him to this craft. Those hours became essential to his well-being, became the time when he felt most himself, most connected to the purpose that had sustained him through grief and loss, and the hard discipline of learning a difficult art. In those hours, he was not Thomas the master illuminator, not Thomas the administrator, not Thomas the teacher. He was simply Thomas the monk, making offerings of beauty with his hands, participating in the great tradition of sacred art that stretched back centuries and would hopefully continue for centuries more. He painted a series of illuminations for the monastery's own use, images that would not be sold or commissioned but that would remain at Lindmore Abbey as testimony to this particular moment, this particular community, this particular illuminator's vision. He painted the monastery itself, showing its buildings and fields and the monks at their various labors. He painted the seasons as they moved across the landscape, spring's greening, summer's abundance, autumn's harvest, winter's quiet. He painted the liturgical year, the cycle of feasts and fasts that structured monastic time. These images were more personal than his commissioned work, less constrained by patron expectations or traditional iconography. They showed his own vision of monastic life, his understanding of what made this community valuable, his testimony to the beauty he found in daily rhythms and simple devotions. They were not his greatest technical achievements. He had painted more complex and ambitious compositions for bishops and nobles, but they were perhaps his most honest work, the images that came closest to showing what he truly saw and felt and believed. His sisters wrote less frequently as years passed, their lives diverging further from his. Agnes eventually remarried, a widower with children who needed a mother, and though the letters suggested this was more arrangement than love match, she seemed to have found some stability, if not happiness. Margaret remained unmarried, becoming the village's informal healer and midwife, a role that gave her purpose and position, if not prosperity. They remembered Thomas in their prayers, they wrote, and they hoped he was well, but the emotional connection that had once bound them had attenuated to the point where they were more like fond acquaintances than family. Thomas accepted this with the same stoic resignation he had learned to apply to other losses. People changed. Circumstances changed. Connections weakened or broke or transformed into something unrecognizable. All he could do was hold gratitude for what had been, acceptance of what was, and hope for what might yet come. The years accumulated. Thomas passed through his 30s into his 40s, his hair beginning to gray at the temples, his eyes requiring better light for fine work, his back protesting the long hours bent over manuscripts. He trained a generation of illuminators, watched them develop from uncertain beginners to skilled craftsmen, took satisfaction in their achievements, and felt the teacher is mixed pride and sadness when they surpassed his own abilities in particular techniques. The scriptorium continued its work, producing manuscripts that carried forward the tradition Michael had established, and that Thomas was now maintaining and extending. Some of these manuscripts would survive centuries, would be treasured in cathedral libraries and noble collections, would be studied by scholars who would marvel at the skill and devotion evident in every painted page. Others would be lost to fire or theft or simple neglect, would crumble to dust or be broken up for their valuable materials, would disappear from the historical record as completely as the monks who made them. But Thomas had learned not to paint for posterity, not to create with the expectation that his work would endure. He painted for this moment, for this page, for the offering he could make today, with the materials at hand and the skill he had developed through decades of practice. If the work survived, that was grace. If it disappeared, that was the nature of all material things. What mattered was that he had made it, had poured his attention and care and skill into creating something beautiful, had participated in the long tradition of sacred art that connected him to craftsmen centuries dead, and to craftsmen who would work centuries after his own death. On a summer morning in his 48th year, Thomas sat at his desk in the scriptorium working on a book of hours that would be his own masterwork, his equivalent to Michael's Psalter. He had been planning it for years, gathering the finest materials, waiting for a commission worthy of his full abilities. When that commission came, from a cardinal in Rome who wanted the finest English illumination for his private chapel, Thomas knew that this was the project he would be remembered for, the work that would justify the decades of practice and teaching and service. He was painting the crucifixion, the central mystery of Christian faith, the moment when divine and human met in suffering and sacrifice and redemptive love. He worked on Christ's face, trying to capture both agony and acceptance, both human pain and divine purpose, both the cry of abandonment and the final surrender to God's will. It was the most difficult face he had ever attempted, requiring everything he had learned about conveying complex emotion through subtle details of expression and gesture. The light through the window struck his page at exactly the right angle, illuminating the gold leaf in Christ's halo so that it seemed to glow with its own light. The ultramarine of the Virgin's mantle at the cross's foot showed all its depth and richness. The vermilion of blood on Christ's wounds stood stark against the pale flesh tones. Every element worked together. Every color choice reinforced the image's meaning. Every compositional decision supported the theological statement the illumination was making. Thomas held his breath and painted the final stroke that completed Christ's eye, a touch of white highlight that brought the entire face to life, that made the painted image seem to look out from the page with awareness and intention, and that quality of suffering love that was Christianity's central claim about God's nature. The brush lifted from the parchment. The stroke was complete, and Thomas sat back and saw that it was good, that he had achieved what he had been reaching for, that this image would speak to viewers with the power and clarity he had hoped to give it. In that moment, Thomas understood what Brother Michael had meant when he said that art could hold what prayer could not, that beauty could transform grief without denying it, that the work of illumination was itself a form of prayer that reached beyond words into the territory of direct experience and transformed understanding. He had spent 30 years learning this craft, 30 years practicing and teaching and creating, 30 years trying to make images that would help others see and feel and know what he himself saw and felt and knew about beauty and suffering and grace. And here on this page, in this image of a crucified Christ whose painted eyes looked out with such terrible compassion, he had succeeded. He had made something that transcended his own skill, that seemed to come from beyond him, even though it had come through him. That was both his work and something larger than his work. It was not perfect, no human work could be perfect, but it was true, and truth was better than perfection, was what perfection actually meant when understood correctly. He covered the page to protect it and bowed his head in thanksgiving for the gift of this work, for the privilege of spending his life making beautiful things, for the teachers who had shared their knowledge, for the community that had supported and sustained him, for the grief that had taught him about the depths of human emotion, and for the craft that had given him a way to transform that grief into something that might offer comfort or insight or simple aesthetic pleasure to others. The bells rang for the next office, and Thomas set down his brush and joined the other monks in their procession toward the church. His body moved through the familiar routines, while his mind remained partly in the scriptorium, seeing again that last stroke, that white highlight in the painted eye, the moment when something ordinary became extraordinary through skill and care and the mysterious grace that sometimes blessed human efforts. He had painted a face that looked back at him with understanding, with compassion, with the kind of love that encompassed suffering rather than avoiding it. He had painted his mother's sorrow and his brother's lost potential and Michael's patient teaching and his own long journey from village boy to master illuminator. He had painted prayer that had no words and beauty that required no explanation and meaning that could be felt, even if it could not be fully articulated. And tomorrow he would return to the desk and begin the next page, would continue the work that was never finished, would make another offering of color and gold and careful attention to detail, would participate once more in the ancient tradition of illumination that connected him to centuries of craftsmen who had known what he now knew, that beauty mattered, that skill was worth developing, that the patient daily work of creating something excellent was itself a form of worship, a way of saying yes to existence despite all the grief and loss and suffering that existence inevitably included. The work would continue, would outlive him as it had outlived Michael and all the other illuminators who had come before, would be carried forward by the monks he had trained and by the monks they would train, would persist as long as there were people who valued beauty and knowledge and the physical objects that carried both forward through time. And Thomas would be part of that long chain, one link among many, connected backward to those who had taught him, and forward to those he had taught, participating in something larger and more enduring than any individual life. This was enough. This was everything. This was the guidance his mother had asked him to seek, and the meaning he had found not in a single revelation, but in the accumulated days and years of devoted practice, in the slow development of skill, in the patient work of creating beauty. One brushstroke at a time, in the discovery that life's meaning was not something to be found, but something to be made, built up layer by layer, like the colors on an illuminated page, mixed from many ingredients applied with care, burnished to bring out the glow, and finally offered to whatever viewers might come, now and in the centuries ahead, to see what one monk in one monastery in one particular moment of history had managed to create from pigment and parchment, and the inexplicable human need to make beautiful things in a world that did not always seem to deserve them, but that needed them nonetheless, needed them desperately, needed them as evidence that meaning was possible, that beauty could be real, that human hands could create what human hearts envisioned, that despite everything, despite plague and death and grief and loss and all the darkness that threatened to swallow everything, light could still shine, color could still glow, and images could still be made that spoke of grace and hope and the stubborn human insistence that existence meant something, that our brief lives had value, that the work of our hands would endure beyond us and would testify to future generations that we were here, that we cared, that we made our offerings of beauty and knowledge and skill, and that those offerings mattered, even if, especially if, they seemed small and inadequate against the vastness of human suffering and the inevitability of death that claimed everyone and everything eventually, but that could not claim what we had created, what we had made permanent through craft and devotion and the mysterious grace that sometimes blessed the work of human hands and lifted it beyond mere skill into something approaching the transcendent, the eternal, the divine spark that lived in every attempt to create beauty in a world that constantly threatened to destroy it, and that would continue living as long as there were people who looked at illuminated manuscripts and saw not just pretty pictures, but windows into the souls of the men who made them, who recognized in painted faces and glowing colors and burnished gold the desperate human hope that beauty could save us, that meaning could be found, that our work could matter, that we could leave behind something worthy of the lives we had lived and the grace we had been given and the terrible, beautiful privilege of being alive. At all in this difficult world where suffering was inevitable but where beauty was also possible, and where the patient daily work of creation was itself a form of prayer, a declaration of faith, a refusal to surrender to despair, and an offering made to God and to the future, and to everyone who would ever need evidence that human beings once existed, who cared enough about beauty to spend their lives creating it one page at a time, one brush stroke at a time, one careful application of color at a time, building up layers of meaning and beauty and skill until something emerged that was more than the sum of its parts, something that spoke without words and taught without preaching and offered without demanding, something that simply was in all its complex, beautiful, imperfect glory, a testament to the value of work and the possibility of meaning and the enduring power of beauty to transform suffering into something that could be born, could be shared, could be offered to others as evidence that life, despite everything, was worth living, was worth working for, was worth illuminating with whatever skill and care and devotion we possessed, in the hope that somewhere, sometime, someone would see what we had made and would understand that they were not alone in their longing for beauty, in their search for meaning, in their desperate hope that existence meant something more than mere survival, more than simply getting through each day, more than the grinding succession of tasks and obligations that filled most lives, that existence could also include moments of transcendence, moments when the work went so well that time disappeared, and self disappeared, and only the work remained, pure and focused and absolutely real, more real than anything else, the one thing that could be trusted when everything else proved uncertain, the one offering that could be made when all other offerings seemed inadequate, the one prayer that could be said when words failed and emotions overwhelmed, and the grief or joy or complex mixture of both that constituted human existence demanded expression in some form that went beyond language and beyond concepts, and into the direct experience of making, of creating, of bringing into being something that had not existed before, and that would not have existed without this particular person making this particular effort in this particular moment. And that was what Thomas offered now and had offered for 30 years and would offer for however many years remained to him, this daily practice of illumination, this patient work of creating beauty, this stubborn insistence that meaning was possible, and that his life would consist of making that meaning visible, one page at a time, one image at a time, one careful brush stroke at a time, until his hand could no longer hold the brush, and his eyes could no longer see the fine details, and his mind could no longer maintain the concentration that illumination required. But until that day came, he would continue, would keep working, would keep making his offerings of beauty and skill and devotion, would keep participating in the great tradition of sacred art that stretched back centuries and would hopefully stretch forward centuries more, carried by monks and craftsmen and artists who understood what he understood now, that the work was everything, that beauty mattered, that skill was worth developing, that the patient daily practice of creating something excellent was itself a form of worship and a way of saying yes to existence, and a declaration that human life had value, that transcended mere survival, and that could be expressed through the work of human hands creating beauty in a world that desperately needed that beauty, even if it could not always recognize or appreciate or properly value what was being offered. But that was all right, that was acceptable, because the work was not offered for recognition or appreciation or proper valuation, but simply because it needed to be done, because someone had to preserve beauty and knowledge and skill against the constant erosion of time and death, and the forces that wanted to reduce everything to dust and forgetting. And Thomas had chosen to be one of those who stood against that erosion, who worked to create rather than destroy, who used his life to make offerings of beauty that might outlive him and might speak to future generations about what mattered and why it mattered and how it could be achieved through patient daily practice and devotion to craft and refusal to accept that the world had to be ugly or meaningless or devoid of grace. Because look, here on this page was evidence that beauty was possible, that meaning could be made visible, that human hands could create what human hearts envisioned, that despite everything the work endured and would continue enduring as long as there were people who cared enough to preserve it and appreciate it, and continue the tradition that had produced it. And this was Thomas's gift to the future, his offering to God, his testimony to the value of a life spent making beautiful things in a world that constantly threatened to destroy them. But that could not finally succeed as long as there were illuminators working in scriptoria, painting pages, mixing colors, laying gold leaf, creating images that would glow on parchment long after their creators had returned to dust, had been forgotten by name, had become simply the Illuminator of Linmore Abbey, circa 1350, anonymous but not voiceless, unknown but not lost, because the work remained and the work spoke, and the work testified to values that transcended any individual life while being absolutely dependent on individual lives for their expression and continuation. And this was the paradox at the heart of craft and tradition and the transmission of knowledge and skill across generations, that it required individuals committed to something larger than themselves, while also requiring that those individuals bring their full selves to the work, their personal vision and individual gifts and unique understanding of what mattered and why and how best to express it. And Thomas brought all of this to his illuminations, brought his grief over his mother, his death, and his gratitude for Michael's teaching and his love for his sisters, and his faith in God and his doubt about whether faith was enough, and his hope that beauty might save what prayer could not, and his fear that nothing could save anything but his determination to keep working anyway, because working was better than not working, and creating was better than not creating, and offering beauty to the world was better than offering nothing, even if the beauty was imperfect, and the offering was inadequate, and the world often seemed indifferent to what was being offered. But he worked anyway, painted anyway, created anyway, made his daily offerings of color and gold and careful attention to detail, and in doing so found the meaning his mother had asked him to seek, found the path that was right for him, even if it was not the path everyone could walk, found the work that made his life make sense even when nothing else made sense, and discovered that this was enough, that this was everything, that this was the answer to questions he had not quite known how to ask, and that he could die content, knowing that he had used his life well, had developed his gifts, had served his community, had preserved beauty and knowledge, had taught the next generation, had made offerings that would endure beyond his lifetime and would speak to people he would never meet about values that transcended any particular moment, while being absolutely grounded in the particular moments when brush touched parchment and color took form, and images emerged that had not existed before, but that seemed now inevitable, seemed meant to be, seemed like they had always existed and were simply waiting to be revealed by someone with the skill and patience and devotion to make them visible. And Thomas had been that someone, had spent his life revealing beauty and meaning through the ancient craft of illumination. And now in his 48th year, he sat in the scriptorium of Linmore Abbey with painted pages surrounding him, and younger monks learning at his elbow, and the tradition continuing through his hands and his teaching and his example. And he knew that whatever came next, whether years of continued work or sudden death like Brother Robert's or slow decline like Brother Michael's, he had already accomplished what mattered, had already made the offerings he was meant to make, had already served as he was meant to serve, had already participated in something larger and more enduring than himself, and this knowledge brought peace, brought satisfaction, brought the kind of deep contentment that came from knowing you had found your right work and had done it well, and could face whatever came next without regret or fear or the sense of having wasted the precious limited time that every human life contained, because his time had been used well, had been used to create beauty, had been used to serve God and community in the future, had been used to make illuminated manuscripts that would carry forward knowledge and beauty, and the testimony of one monk's devoted practice of an ancient craft in a monastery in England in the middle of the 14th century, when the world was dangerous and uncertain and full of suffering, but also full of possibility, and beauty and grace for those who knew how to look for it and how to make it visible for others who might not know where to look but who would recognize it when they saw it, and who would be grateful that someone had cared enough to create it and to preserve it and to offer it to them across the centuries as evidence that beauty was possible and that meaning could be made and that human lives could be spent in ways that justified the terrible privilege and responsibility of being alive at all.